Hey guys, welcome back. It is your favorite Gimp of the Limp, and I'm here with a special treat for you all. This is Blitz in the East by Venta Nuovo Games. They were nice enough to send me a copy of this. Now, this game is a streamlined version of the war in the East during World War II, so it gives you the ability to play a game that simulates that conflict without it taking weeks upon weeks upon weeks. One of my favorites that I've always talked about is Thunder in the East, but that game it's awesome, but it's so huge you can't just put it on the table and play it. You got to really dedicate some time to it. Blitz in the East, though, takes up a much smaller footprint, a lot less counter dense, and you're able to get through especially some of the shorter scenarios like just Barbarossa in an evening or two versus having to take days upon days to be able to play through the whole conflict. But I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and go down to the table so I can show you the game and the components and a little bit of how it plays, and then we'll come back for some final thoughts. All right, so here we are down at the table. You guys see I've got the game set up here for all of you to check out, and we're going to go over the components real quick. Now, when it came to the rule book, I was generally impressed with it. It doesn't go on for too long. Total pages is 30, and that includes all of the optional rules and then a few pages telling you what all the different cards do, things like that. And the scenarios are in here too. So the roles aren't that long, and it made me think originally when I was reading up on the game that it wasn't going to be very complex. Like I mentioned, when it comes to games like Thunder in the East, it's excellent, it's massive, it's cool, it's awesome, but it's so big and so deep and so complex that you can't really set it up and just play it. You really need to have at least a week just dedicated just to that game alone. And this game, I think they went in a different direction. They really want to make it a Eastern Front game that is playable. It gives you a experience that is on par with something like Thunder in the East without the huge complexity that comes with that, the massive amount of counters. This game has one counter sheet. One. There are a few others, like I showed you in the unboxing, but those are just different unit counters you can use. When it comes to the actual counters of the game, they got them all down on one sheet, and it's the whole Eastern Front you can do from Barbarossa to the end with one counter sheet. And again, that's why I was expecting the game to be very simplistic, and it's not. There's a lot going on here that I didn't expect, and they actually have something in this game that I have never seen any other war game. I'm not saying no other war game has done it, but I have not seen any war game do this before, and I'll touch on it when we start talking about how the game plays. All right, but the map that comes with the game is mounted. You can see the majority of it. There's a few parts that are slightly off camera. I'll tell to those here in just a sec. But like I said, we got one sheet of counters. We've got a mounted map. There are a handful of cards that come with the game that will be introduced, varying on different turns, and they kind of represent the different events that happened throughout the Eastern Front War. I'll touch on that again when we start talking about how the game itself plays. And besides all of that, we do have one player aid. Now, of course, there are two player aids total in the game, but there's only one player aid front and back for each player. And that's all you need when it comes to this game, which is, again, why I thought it was going to be very, very simple. But it's not. Now, like I said, there are the two extra counter sheets that you could get that just represent the counters in different ways, but that's not extra components. Those are just ones that you can use if you don't want to use the NATO symbols. I just stuck with the NATO symbols. I think they work well enough. The only other thing that I haven't shown you guys is this actually came in after I got the base game itself. The vinyl map for the game, and you can see as I'm holding it up here, this is way bigger than the the regular mounted version. The hexes on this one are about 3 times the size of the hexes here. I like that. It gives you a lot of room. This is actually so big it doesn't fit on my table, so you would need a fairly large table to set up this map of the game, but it is very nice. Now, this is an extra. This doesn't come with the base game itself. All right, so I'm going to pan to a couple of spots on the map just to show them to you real quick. That way you know what parts I'm talking about when I start talking about how this game is played. Over here on this lower right side of the map, because remember, vertical is this way, all right? The top of the map board is up that way. I've just got it turned sideways so it fits on my my table. This is our turn record track. There's a tiny, oh shit. There's a tiny, cute little turn record counter here. It's got the axis one side and the Soviet turn on the other side. And again, I mean, all these counters, just look how thick the counters are for this game. Good grief. Cool thing about this is it tells you what the weather's going to be. So you don't have to worry about that, right? You don't have to worry about rolling for weather every turn or any of that crap. It's right here on the turn record track. You see some days are clear, representing certain times of the year, and then some are snow, rainy or overcast or snow, just depending on what time of year you are in. This is also going to be when your cards are going to come into play. So looking at our cards here in the upper right, if they've got like the green hand symbol or check mark, they will start in your hand, right? But if they have a number, then that correlates to what turn they are coming into. And while we're talking about cards, very quickly, let me go ahead and just tell you about this. There are vertical cards and horizontal cards. Vertical cards are your strategic cards, and they will be played during the strategic part of the game. And then the horizontal cards, these are tactical cards. These will play during combat. So if you got ground combat or blitz combat going on, that's when these come in. And then during that admin phase, this is when the strategic cards play. All right, so besides our turn record track, we see we've got a couple of spots for destroyed units to go to. And I'll show you the other spots in just a second, but these are only for units that are destroyed while in supply. If you're out of supply, your units go to a different spot. Axis units are actually, they're considered surrendered if they are destroyed by a Soviet unit without being able to be in supply. And they're wiped from the game completely. They cannot be rebuilt. Soviets go to a similar spot, but they do stand a chance of coming back into the game. Down here, this is our supremacy boxes. This will come into play during the combat section of the game. And if we look, we've got two different types of superiority, armor and air. So during that section of the game, if you have supremacy in one of those, you will mark it down with the counter, and they are double-sided to simulate the fact of Axis and the Soviets. That will get you column shifts during the combat section of the game, which are really important. If you have those column shifts, it gives you a much better chance of winning the combat. All right, so down here at the bottom left of the board, this is where you're going to have your production and victory tracker. So obviously, like victory points, you'll put a counter down here. Right now, I've got it set up for the starting counters for the campaign. So if like you're doing the grand campaign, the start of Barbarossa to the end, right? This is where these counters are going to start. There are different types of counters. There are ones that will signify your income, right? So you're either going to have goods and oil, depending on how many spots across the map that you control. You will keep track of those with two specific counters, and then the amounts that you have will be controlled by two other counters. So you got 4 each for the Axis and the Soviets, telling you how many they have and how many they are getting each turn. This is crucially important because this is going to be used for things like reconstituting your unit. So buying new units back onto the map if they were destroyed, and they can be bought back, upgrading them from cadre to full power. So cadre is basically half power. It's the back side of the counter. If this one is on its cadre side, and flip it over, that's its full strength side. So you will use production points to do that as well. But something very, very neat in this, we're going to get into when we start talking about how the game's played, is that you will also use these points, goods and oil, to buy combat chits. You have to pay to play in this game. There's no just going out there, no, we're just going to fight now. It's not like other games. It's not like that. You actually have to buy the ability to be able to attack on your turn. There's a whole attrition phase, and then that determines how many of these attack points that you'll get, which will allow you to conduct attacks all across the line. But if you did not buy the ability to attack, you don't get to attack. And there's a little counter to represent that. So the Germans, the Axis, they buy it. And then on the Soviet turn, if they buy it, they get the counter to signify the fact that they do get to attack during this turn. That is the coolest aspect about this game, something that I have not seen any other game. You actually have to allocate resources to your combat actions. You don't just get to attack. If you have not allocated or you don't have the resources to pay, you don't get to attack. And it's going to cost you 2 goods and 2 oil per turn each time you want to get that combat chit. Now, there are some special rules that can go into it. The Soviets can play a certain card that will make it cost twice as much for them, but they get other discounts. We'll touch on that here in just a sec. All right, and just to show you the rest of the map real quick, up here we do have a legend. This tells us about the different types of hexes across the board. There are urban hexes, there are rough hexes, and heavy hexes, and then obviously clear hexes are just clear. But things like rough, that's going to be your forest and hills. So they are equivalent in game speak, right, for the effects that they have on your movement, your combat, stuff like that. Forests and hills are the same. Swamp and mountains are the same. They're the heavy terrain. Besides that, there is a little legend here that tells you about the different special parts of the board. Things like little oil derricks here or factories, which are symbolized by this here. And then you can have also mines. Let me say, oh, we got one right there. Mines and factories give you goods, and then oil derricks obviously give you oil. So having control of those different urban areas, or in this case, like a clear hex that has the mine, will get you more resources. Obviously, you'll keep track of that on that production track that I was just showing you. Also here, you see this high whiz is what I call it, the high whiz box. This is where the Soviet units go that are surrendered, right? So the ones that are destroyed while not being in supply, they will go to this box. I'll show you the one that the Axis goes to here in just a second. And when it comes to tracing to supply, you're going to trace to areas that are like your main hubs. So Berlin here is one of their main hubs for the Axis. And then we have Vienna here. You see G1 and G2. So as long as you can trace a uninterrupted line of hexes, so no enemy units or zones of control, you can trace it of any length back to this spot, you're going to be considered in supply. And I'll show you where the Soviets do that here in just a sec. All right, so you see this is the upper right panel of the board. This is Siberia that does have some production sources for it. Oil and then 3 goods are listed down on it. But this is also the box where Axis units go that are destroyed while out of supply. So you see this is the upper right panel of the board. We see Siberia up here. That's where Axis units go if they are destroyed while out of supply. They're sent off to Siberia, considered surrendered, and cannot be rebuilt for the remainder of the game. There are also some production units there, 3 goods and 1 oil. And then across over here, you see a bunch of other, factories, mines. We've got a factory there. And then also our hexes that we're going to trace for line of supply for the Soviets are represented here. We got an S1 here and an S2 over there. So as long as they can trace a line of supply uninterrupted of any number of hexes, just like the Axis back over to here, they are going to be considered into supply. We also have victory point hexes on the map. You see these little symbols here, 2, 3. We got Leningrad up here. That's a major city that they're going to go after. And then also some places do have the rail symbol. Now, for simplicity's sake, they did not actually put the rail lines on the board. They're basically considered anywhere, but for strategic movement purposes, you can go from one railhead to another as strategic movement. Only thing is you can't use that to move to the front. And when I'm talking about this game, when I say the front, I basically mean adjacent to an enemy unit. So wherever the line of battle is on the board, you can't use strategic movement to get right there, but you could go up close to it, just not all the way to it. Our air units, which are represented by these round counters, can also do a strategic type of movement. Obviously, they don't have to use rail lines. They can fly up to twice their listed movement, which is going to be the right number. When it comes to our ground counters, all of them are going to mean the same thing. First number is their strength. Second number is their movement. And obviously, if they're higher, their full strength side will be higher numbers than the cadre side. Now, something I just want to take and say real quick that I like that they did here is for ease of setup, all the unit counters are listed down on the board. So you see every one of these counters that I move, you see the unit represented with its symbol inside there. I would have liked to have seen that maybe be just a touch bigger. It's harder on some of us older guys with eyesight that isn't perfect anymore to see those tiny numbers. But it's not too bad. It's just like a little scotch bigger might have helped. But I understand they didn't want to crowd the hex too much. But every unit that you see laid out across the board is represented here on the board. There's an actual symbol for that counter, and it tells you whether or not they're going to be full strength. Like the 17th here is full strength, and you can tell because the black side is filled in. If it's not full strength, it'll be whited out in the same symbol that's on the cadre side. So very, very, very easy to set up this game. Just start at the top, work your way down, and check to make sure you don't miss any. There are a few counters that don't start on the board, but they will be added to the game through card play later on as you get through the turns. All right, so let's talk about our turns and the gameplay, how that's going to work. Sequence of play is shown here on our little player aid card, and it tells us how we will start with any card draws that will apply to that turn and then go to strategic card employment. Remember, strategic are the vertical, not the horizontal cards. You will check to make sure your units are in supply. Any that aren't will be marked. You will collect your production points, and then you can reinforce entry and production point expenditure. Basically, that means you're buying units, reinforcing units, all that type stuff. Strategic rail and air operational movements. That's what I was just talking about here with the rail symbols on the board. You can move units to wherever you want them to, as long as they're connected by these rail lines and not moving to the front. So you can't move adjacent to these enemy units. After that, we go to our attrition phase, and that's what I'm going to spend the most time on. The attrition, attack, and blitz phase is the different aspect of this game that really sets it apart from other Eastern Front games. We'll get into that in just a sec. Production cost, this just tell you how much things cost, right? The gold square symbol is your goods. The little oil drop is your oil, obviously, and that's going to be all the different types. So you can, if a unit is disorganized, basically it's taken a hit, you can reinforce or make it organized again. You can reinforce it from cadre. This is what all of that is going to cost. If you buy the combat chit, you actually get a couple of free reorganize your unit markers. So basically you can pay for the combat marker and get to either reorganize 2 of your units that are not at the front or 1 that is at the front. That's what this far right side represents. There is an added cost to doing this, any of these reinforcements in the like 2 units that are at the front. And right, so it's harder to supply units that are in combat with enemy units, obviously. Any of your movement, attrition, ground combat modifiers for all the different hexes. It's going to be shown here. So how much it costs to move here, move there, if it's forbidden, if you can't during certain weather, if something's frozen over, it's not. All that is shown right here. Pretty easy to understand. You'll notice that they are red and green. That has to do with the attrition that we're going to talk about in a sec. But basically, the green ones can be claimed during the attrition phase, red ones can't. And then on the backside, it gets into the air superiority. And that's basically any of your air units that can reach upfront units within their movement allowance, right? So these air units have a movement allocation of 5. So obviously they would be considered as part of being upfront, right? They can get to enemy units. Your units themselves have to be upfront and normally in good supply. There's a little back and forth on that, but generally speaking, you want them organized and in supply to count as part of your superiority. And you're only going to be looking for air and armor during this little segment of the game. And you have to have a greater than 2-to-1, right? You can't have it be less than that and have superiority. But if you've got both of these, that's 2 shifts on your attrition table here. And you see how big of a difference that's going to make. That's like simulating that you're adding so many points worth of combat value to your units if you can get that superiority. Very important. Also, something I like that they have here is how hits are applied to your units. Units start at full strength. If they take a hit, they go to disorganized. If they take another hit, they go down to cadre, but organized cadre. So the disorganized doesn't stay. If they take another hit, they become disorganized cadre, and then obviously another hit destroys them. So 4 hits total that a unit can take from full strength to gone. This is what we're going to get into. The attrition table and the combat table. Combat table is easy. If you've seen a combat table before, you got to understand how this works. This is just you basic combat, with the exception that if you start totaling your combat values and you did it wrong and you're not at least a 1-to-1, you lose that combat chit, right? So you get those tokens during this phase to apply, right, to perform ground combat. And if you pick a spot that isn't high enough once all the modifiers are applied and it is 1-to-2 or under, then you lose that combat chit and the combat does not take place. There is a time that allows Soviets, if they play a certain strategic card, to make combat attacks at a 1-to-2 so they can attack a superior enemy unit, but that's special play with a strategic card. And then here, this represents the fact that if you're attacking at these levels, there is mandatory defender retreat. Obviously, all the stuff down here, these are the different modifiers will come into effect. Things like disorganized units can't do that. If you're attacking across a river, you're halved. If it's rainy, you're attacking ground units halved. If it's snowy, certain things are halved or can't do it. Blizzard, it's quartered. Defending is halved. All the different modifiers that apply here. All right, so what do I mean by the attrition table and getting your combat shits? All right, so let's say we're in the turn sequence. We've already done ground movement because just normal ground movement is done before the attrition phase. And then after, that's when you have your little attack and blitz phase. Blitz is basically extra movement and extra attack, but it's very regimented. For the moment, let's focus on this attrition aspect. Attrition is, what's the best way to describe this? It's kind of like a form of combat that you're not really choosing to be done. It just simulates the fact that there's skirmishes up and down the line during this, right? So these turns are taking place over a rather substantial period of time. So they have to kind of simulate some of the smaller battles that are going on across this. So what you're going to do is total up the combat values of all combatants who are up front, right? So Axis and Soviet, they're going to be totaled up. So let's say the Axis is the acting faction, right? It's their turn. They get to total all of their combat units that are up front, so adjacent to enemy units. However, they do have to be in supply and not disorganized, right? So they can't have the disorganized little counter on them, and they have to be able to trace a line of supply. All of those units are going to be considered valid, and you will total up their combat value. When it comes to the non-phasing players, so in this case it would be the Soviets, all of their upfront units count even if they are out of supply and disorganized. So the non-phasing player gets kind of a chance to count more of their units than the phasing player does. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to get a total for each side, and then that's going to be the value that you compare on this table, right? All right, so once you've got your two numbers, you're going to compare it on this chart to see how many hits and movements that get to be applied here. All right, and just for ease of play, let's say that the defending Soviets had 30 and the Axis had 55, right? You would cross-index those two numbers and you would get to here, 2-1. But let's say that the Axis had air and armor superiority. That would get them 2 column shifts. So instead of being 2-1, now it's 4-1. What that means is there are 4 hits applied to the Soviet units, 1 hit that is applied to the Axis units. Now it's player's choice. They get to choose where the hits go. And then the Axis player gets to have 4 tokens to advance. And what I mean by that are these little tokens. They're front and back, black side on one for the Axis, red for the Soviets when it's their turn. And you will get a number of these tokens equal to the hits that are applied. Now, besides that, if the Axis player has purchased a combat chit this turn, they also get that number of tokens that they can use to conduct combat. So in this case, this is what the Axis player would get. They would get to pick 4 hexes for attrition movement. So basically, they get to claim that hex, and any Soviet unit in it has to retreat. And if they can't retreat, then they're destroyed. So obviously, you can see how having that air and armor superiority is such a crucial thing to have, because it can really slam you across this table. And remember, if you don't buy this token, you're not even going to be doing anything on this. This is the chart where you're rolling to see how many hits each side are, taking, blah, 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 the normal combat. But that doesn't even get to happen unless you have purchased this token. And when we go to this phase, it only gets to happen this many times. So these are the number of hexes that the Axis player on their turn would be able to choose to attack during this turn. So just for example, like I said, let's say the marker's placed here. Then this unit is choosing to push this unit back. They would have to be able to retreat to a hex that is not up front, so not adjacent to an enemy. If they can't retreat into a non-upfront hex, they will take an extra hit. If they can't retreat at all, then they die. The unit that goes there gets to make its move. And you will do that for all of these. So you'll pick 4, and then obviously, like I said, 4 Soviet units get just automatic hits. 1 Axis unit would get an automatic hit. You'll place these out, and then you're going to go to the combat phase, the ground combat phase, and you will choose 4 hexes to attack. So when it comes to the actual attacks themselves, it's not much different than any other combat that we've seen using a combat results table and any other type of war game, right? It's easy to understand. You get your total value, right? You can get extra bonuses if you have a enemy unit surrounded. That can get you extra column shifts. So let me grab a marker here. Let's just say that we're attacking here, right? This is one of the attacks that we're choosing to make. We would get an extra column shift because this unit is being attacked from 2 non-adjacent hexes. But if we were able to do it this way, let me grab one more, and we've got 3 non-adjacent hexes, that's 2 column shifts. So the usual type of bonuses that we've seen in combat games before. Again, there are armor and air support can get you certain bonuses, certain shifts on the combat results table. And you'll roll your d6 and just determine how many hits are applied. Blue numbers will be the defender, red numbers will be the attacker, and how many hits are applied. Remember, combat not allowed down here unless you're Soviets. You can get it to the 1 to 2, but other than that, if you figure out your combat odds after applying for all the modifiers and shifting of tables, and you're not at least a 1 to 1, that's what I mean by you lose this combat chit. No combat would take place, but you've still spent one of your combat chits, and you only get so many. So you don't want to waste those on an attack that's not going to be able to happen. Now, besides all of this ground combat that I was talking about, we also have the Blitz phase. Now, the Blitz phase is more ground movement and combat, right? So you can do another ground movement and do up to as many combats as you have combat chits, right? During your normal ground combat phase, you get X amount of chits based on the attrition table. And then if you have units that qualify to Blitz, they have up to the same amount of tokens that they get to use. Oh, and before I forget to mention it, because I did forget to mention earlier when we were talking about the attrition table, the air reaction markers, there is a number of those that the defender would get. In this case, for our example, the 4 to 1, the defender would get 1. So they would be able to choose one of their air units that is within its movement range to come in and defend against one of these attacks. But getting back to the Blitz, you can only conduct a Blitz phase if you have purchased the offensive chit that we talked about, and you have one Blitz capable, organized, and supplied full strength armor unit available. And then if you do have that, you can have other units that are like air units or infantry units that are adjacent to said armor unit. Now, besides all of that I just mentioned, to be able to perform blitzes, you also do have to have some strategic cards to play. For example, both of these, the Guderian and Kleist cards, allow the 1st or 2nd Panzer to be able to conduct a blitz attack. So you have to have the combination of everything. You got to have the combat chit. You got to have some of these tokens that you can use. The unit has to be full strength, in supply, and not disorganized. And you got to have the card play. So you're not going to have a huge amount of blitzes going on, but if you can organize it right, it gets you a chance to have extra combat actions on your turn against your enemy, which can really cause some swings in the game. Now, besides all of that we were just talking about, there is a final phase. You'll do your final victory check for any victory markers that apply. There are some shorter scenarios for things like just Barbarossa, where you're just trying to capture a few cities, or like I said, the entire campaign from Barbarossa on. So it just depends on which scenario you're playing, on what your victory check's going to be. But there is a final supply check, and units that are out of supply during this supply check will receive 2 hits on that hit chart that I was talking about. This is how all your hits are applied. And if the unit suffers 2 hits and it causes it to be destroyed, remember, if they get surrendered, they don't go to the destroyed box where they can be rebuilt. They go to Siberia where they can't be rebuilt. So obviously what I have shown here is just a highlight of the basics of how the game is going to be played. But I think you can see the real differences and how the game is much deeper than I originally thought, especially with the fact that you have to maintain your resources to be able to keep up that flow of combat. You can't just attack everywhere, right? This buying of the combat chit and getting only so many tokens to actually conduct those ground combat maneuvers I think do a good job of simulating the fact that your strength, your focus in the war can only be in so many places at once. And if you are managing your resources appropriately and keeping your units positioned well, you will do better in that attrition phase, will get you more of these tokens. And these tokens, which will allow you to continually push the enemy back and try to take those strongholds and resource points from them. And obviously, this is going to apply back and forth. But let's go ahead and head on back, and I will give you the final thoughts for Blitz in the East. All right, so welcome back. It's me again, and now we can get into some final thoughts about the game. Obviously, you could probably tell during my review of the components and the gameplay that I like this game. I like that it offers something different from what we've seen in other war games. This is the first war game that I've ever seen that had you dedicate resources to attacking specifically. I've never seen the other game do that. Plenty of other games have simulated the fact that you've had to spend resources towards resupplying your units or keeping them supplied, keeping them in communication, rebuilding a unit if they got completely wiped out. All of that's been done before, but this is the first time I've ever seen a game that made you actually pay resources to be able to conduct ground operations during the conflict. Not only that, but you couldn't just conduct unlimited ground combat actions. You only got a limited amount based on how that attrition table was handled, right? So the position of your units, position them to give yourself air superiority, armor superiority, having the right units at the front can give you extra points on that table, gave you better odds, which obviously would give hits during that section of the game, that phase of the game, but it would also give you more of those tokens that you could use to conduct actions. I like that aspect. It makes the combat so much more visceral, so much more important. You couldn't just fight all up and down the line. You have to pick very specifically where you want to focus your attacks. And then your opponent obviously is going to have to focus very specifically on where they want to focus their attacks and then attempt to stop your advance. And furthering on into it, also the Blitz section of the gameplay, that is a tremendous thing to be able to take advantage of. And the fact that it's giving you extra ground movement and more chances at combat, because obviously combat is limited in this game. So having that opportunity to conduct some blitz attacks can give you a chance to open up a front, get behind the enemy units, make it to where they can't retreat. And obviously, if they can't retreat, they're going to get destroyed. So it gives you a chance to really focus in on those areas and make some holes and really focus your advance. But you can only do it in those very specific circumstances. You got to have the right cards to be able to be played. And then, of course, your units have to be able to conduct the blitz. They have to be full strength. They have to be in supply. They have to be up front. All of these things all have to come together. So it makes it to where you're much more focused on what you're doing, and you'll take certain hits to certain units to protect maybe your blitzing units so they stay full strength and are able to continue to push on. Obviously, I do think the components for the game are fantastic. The mounted map is really good. The only thing that I can ding the mounted map on is I found when I was unfolding it that the creases for the folds on the map were a little thinner than I would have preferred. Since this is a mounted map and you have to unfold it, I did have one little spot that tore a little bit. I was able to repair it easily, but I would have liked to have seen that maybe just be a little bit thicker so it doesn't stand as much of a chance of tearing. I do like the fact that they have the option to get the big vinyl map so you can really space it out. I think that will come in handy in this game because the units can stack. You can have a couple of ground units for the Axis, one technically for the Soviets, but they can play some cards to get to where they can have 2 units stacked in the same hex. And then you also obviously have air unit bases that are in those hexes as well. So having the bigger map does make it easier to kind of space the counters out within a single hex instead of, stacking them on top of each other. It's not a necessity, but it's a nice bonus to have. When it comes to dings for the game, my ding for the game is also the bonus for the game, and the fact of the way the combat is handled. I think newer players to the game will have some issues when it comes to the attrition table, because that's a newer thing. That's something that I haven't seen done in another war game, and I could see newer players making mistakes. And it does get a little cumbersome. You're going to be doing that each turn. You have to figure out exactly what units count as up front, which air units, because they have to be within certain ranges to be able to be counted. And it, as you can see, the numbers go up pretty high. You're talking about adding together a bunch of different factors up to 50, 60, 70, 80 worth of strength points. And then not to mention there are modifiers that things like a fortress unit gets to multiply its factor by 3. So I could really see someone having to pull out a calculator or a pen and paper and just jot down the numbers each turn just to make sure they could keep it straight in their head as they're tallying together. Obviously, if you're playing against an opponent, that's going to be easier because each side's going to tally their own. But if you're like me and you're playing the game solitaire, yes, 100%, I would recommend writing down the numbers. Use a die, use whatever, use your phone, just something to be able to keep the numbers down. If it was just adding them, it wouldn't be as bad. But like I said, there are some modifiers that do come into play that double or triple the value of the unit. And when you're adding all that, cross the one, cross the, it can get just a little bit cumbersome. Same thing when it comes to the ground combat. You're, like I said, not having just all the units being able to fight. I can see that throwing people a little bit at first as they get used to how this game is played. And it can cause maybe some confusion. You're not able to just use those advanced tokens into any hex. There are certain free advances that you can make. There's a lot of if this and that. So it's both good and bad in its way. It's going to take a little bit more to kind of get into this game, but that's where the depth of the game is coming from. It's not a beer and pretzels Eastern Front game where it's, oh, his combat value is 3, his combat value is 6. Okay, it's 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. We're going to roll on this table. Oh, they get a +1. You know, it's not basic like that. There's a lot more going on. So it gives you a much deeper, richer combat experience than you would with just a basic CRT. But with that, with the deeper experience comes the fact that it's going to increase your chance to make mistakes, increases the amount of time it takes to get through a turn. You're not able to just, roll through the turn and go. Like I said, you got to tally these numbers up, add them up, figure out what your odds are. You're constantly having to check for armor superiority, air superiority, back and forth. So there is more going on. It's going to take you longer to get through the turns. But I think Eastern Front players are not going to really have much of a problem with this, because if you've played Eastern Front games, you've probably already gotten used to the bigger representation, the simulated combat, the fact that the gameplay isn't going to be as streamlined when you're talking about this massive swatch of space, depending on what game you're playing, how big the map's going to be, how many counters. There are some Eastern Front games that have thousands of unit counters. So I think Eastern Front players are really going to kind of lean into this and not be bothered by it too much. So anyway, when it comes to blitzing these, I would definitely recommend this, especially for Eastern Front fans. I think you're going to find a lot to love here. It's not an overcosted game. It's not going to cost you hundreds of dollars. It can add up a little bit depending on what expansions you do get into. I'm going to touch on the Scorched Earth expansion later on, but you're perfectly fine with just the base box. There's so much detail in just the base box that will give you plenty of gameplay, and especially those counters are just phenomenal. They are the thickest counters I have ever seen in a war game. Only one other game has ever had thicker counters, and it was a generic power game that, for whatever reason, they had massive thick counters. This one, biggest ones by far. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Make sure you go check out Blitz in the East by Venta Nuovo Games. All right, y'all take care. I'll catch you in the next one.